Welcome to the Robert-Koch-Memorial Symposium for the Centennial of the Union. I'm Dean Schroffnagel, and I will be your moderator of this look into the history of the Union. We have four distinguished speakers who will tell the story of the early days of the Union and how different organizations worked closely with it to defeat tuberculosis. On March 24th, 1882, Robert Koch presented his work simply entitled Über Tuberculosis, on tuberculosis, to the Berlin Physiologic Society. He began his talk by reminding the audience that tuberculosis was the foremost enemy of mankind, at times killing up to 1/7 of a population. He said he had discovered a new way of staining bacteria and a method of growing the bacteria in artificial culture media. He had isolated the bacteria from the gray tubercles of infected animals and injected them into other laboratory animals to produce the identical disease. Although the contagious nature of tuberculosis had been shown by Willimann, almost 20 years earlier, Koch so methodically presented his evidence that it convinced even major skeptics. Like an electric jolt, Koch's message spread across the world. Stories appeared in the world's great newspapers in the next few days. His paper was published within 3 weeks. It set in motion a clamor for action against this great scourge. It ignited scientists in many countries and created a need to share knowledge. It called for an international, unifying, anti-tuberculosis organization to provide the infrastructure for communication for these scientists. This organization was the Union. It wasn't just the scientific committee that needed a platform to communicate. The public wanted to know more about tuberculosis. And this knowledge triggered a demand for a cure and an international organization to oversee its development. This organization was the Union. In the halcyon days of spa and bath treatment, the first cures put forth were fresh air and cool climate. Sanitaria met this need. At the start of the 20th century, sanitaria sprang up in cities and townships everywhere. But who was going to support them? Einar Hopewell, a postal worker in Copenhagen, issued Christmas seals to obtain money for tuberculosis. In the first year, 1904, he raised 67,000 Danish krone, enough to build a sanitarium in Kolding. The next year saw Christmas seals providing funding for sanitarium in many states, but competition and conflict sometimes arose. Regional and then national anti-tuberculosis organizations established jurisdictions and practices and advocated for tuberculosis control. But an international organization was needed to coordinate a global approach. This organization was the Union. National public health programs struggled to keep up with the best way to manage tuberculosis and appealed for a unified strategy. An international organization was needed to advise them and advocate for tuberculosis control. This organization was the Union. To achieve the best methods for TB control, the Union promoted and carried out research and communications. It assisted national tuberculosis programs, trained public health care workers, and held international meetings. But the Union would not stop there. The knowledge and application of research and the eventual cure often did not reach many populations. Who was to step up for the poor and underserved people of the world? The Union would. In recent years, the Union has seen the devastation caused by other threats to health, such as tobacco and air pollution. It's developed programs addressing these urgent problems. Today, we celebrate the centennial of the Union and the many people and organizations who have grown and sustained it in the fight against tuberculosis and lung disease. That concludes the first segment.
Welcome to this exceptional Robert-Koch lecture. Because this year the German Central Committee Against Tuberculosis celebrates its foundation 125 years ago, and concurrently the Union celebrates its centenary, the Robert-Koch lecture provides a good occasion to look back on the long relationship between these two organizations. I have no conflict of interest to report. In my lecture, I will try to cover 3 topics and their links with each other. First, Robert Koch and his fight against TB. The cartoon on the left from 1890 shows him as the new St. George fighting with his microscope against TB, symbolized here by a big snake. Second, the history of the German Central Committee Against TB, founded in 1895. And third, the history of the Union, founded in 1920. Unfortunately, because of chronologically parallel events, I have sometimes to jump from one topic to the other. The Robert-Koch lecture was initiated by Rudolf Herlings as Secretary General of the German Central Committee. He was at the same time President of the Union since 1991 and of the 1994 World Conference in Mainz, Germany. The photo shows him on the left after awarding the Union Medal to the Executive Director of the Union, Annick Rouillon, and to Karel Stublo, former Executive Director of the Union and pioneer of the STOTS strategy at this 25th Union World Conference on Lung Health in Mainz, Germany in 1994. Since 1994, 6 very interesting Robert Koch lectures have been given by prominent TB experts at the Union World Conferences as shown on the slide. Coming to the roots of the Union, as described in 2000 by Don Anderson and Annick Rouillon in CDC TB notes. The first time was in Paris in 1876 that TB was a topic of an international conference. International conferences specifically addressing TB followed in Paris, Berlin, and Naples. At the 1899 conference in Berlin, for the first time, 200 official governmental representatives were present. Altogether, about 2,000 international TB experts participated. The progress in several TB areas, as well as the organization of periodic conferences, called for a centralized agency for coordination and communication. At the 1902 Congress in Berlin, an International Central Bureau for the Fight Against Tuberculosis was established, which can be seen as predecessor of the Union. It had its headquarters in Berlin, and Gotthold Panwitz, Secretary General of the German Central Committee, which is shown on the photo, took over the management of the Bureau and of the international monthly journal Tuberculosis. The Lorraine Cross was adopted as symbol of the crusade against TB, here shown in its original dimension. In 1895, Panwitz was the main initiator of the foundation of the German Central Committee for the establishment of sanatoria for lung patients, one of the oldest national TB organizations worldwide. There were 4 reasons for the foundation of this committee. The first was medical, since TB was at that time the leading cause of mortality in Germany, in particular in middle-aged persons. TB was responsible for more than 40% of deaths among persons between 25 and 40 years old. Another reason was social. Since TB mainly affected the lower social class, it was in the interest of the governing class to counter criticism about the situation coming in particular from the recently established trade unions and social democrats. A further reason was political. The government wanted to keep control over the beginning activities of regional non-governmental TB organizations. The great interest is reflected in the composition of the Presidium and its board of directors. Members were high-ranking politicians and military personalities. The imperial chancellor took over the honorary presidentship. An important member was the Minister of the Interior, who was in charge of health issues. And the Empress herself, Catherine Auguste Victoria, shown on the photo, took over the patronage. Last but not least, military reason played an important role with strong links between the government, the military, and the German Red Cross. As Panwitz argued, if we fight against consumption, we will greatly enhance our people's ability to wage war. Because other aspects in TB had become more important for TB control, in particular the ambulance care in special dispensaries, the name was changed in 1905. Sorry, because other aspects in TB had become more important for TB control, in particular the ambulance care and specialty TB dispensaries. The name was changed in 1905 from Committee for the Establishment of Sanatoria to Committee for the Fight Against Tuberculosis. At that time, the number of sanatoria and Prussia had increased substantially, as you can see on the figure, from only 10 in 1882 to almost 100 in 1905. The change of the aims was the reason that in 1906, Robert Koch finally accepted to join the committee, since he was quite critical of the sanatorium movement. In the year before, in 1905, he had been awarded the Nobel Prize for a seminal discovery of the tuberculous in 1882. Robert Koch retained his interest in TB until his death. On April 7, 1910, he gave his last lecture entitled Epidemiology of Tuberculosis at the Academy of Science at Berlin. The figure, only one of the many he demonstrated in this lecture, shows that TB mortality had declined in Prussia between 1875 and 1907 by almost 50%. At the end of the lecture, Robert Koch gave the following recommendations, which are in part still valid today. Improvement of social conditions, in particular of the housing situation, registration of TB mortality, today called surveillance, more stringent TB control measures, and the isolation of infectious patients. 2 days after the lecture, in the night of 9 to 10 April 1910, Robert Koch suffered from acute stenocardia, which must be interpreted as myocardial infarction, accompanied by pulmonary edema. Afterwards, he had to keep bed rest for more than 4 weeks before he went on May 20 to a sanatorium in Baden-Baden, where he was found dead in the evening of May 27, described as sitting in an armchair with a view towards the blooming trees in the garden. Coming back to international TB cooperation. Periodic international conferences systematically addressing clinical research and sociological aspects of TB were held until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, by which the international cooperation was suddenly interrupted. During the war, mortality by TB increased steeply in many belligerent and even in some non-belligerent countries, as shown in the figure from Drollet's article World War I and Tuberculosis. After the war, a conference on TB was convened in Paris in 1920. 31 countries participated. During this conference, the International Union Against Tuberculosis, IUT, was founded. Until 1939, 10 international conferences followed. Germany, as enemy state, was accepted as member only in 1926, represented by the German Central Committee. It participated for the first time at the 1928 conference in Rome. In September 1939, the 11th conference was planned to take place in Berlin, for which a comprehensive brochure entitled The Fight Against Tuberculosis in Germany had already been printed in German language, as shown on the right. But the conference had to be cancelled because World War II had been started by Germany on 1st of September with the invasion of Poland. At this point, I will give only a few comments on the very dark chapter during the Nazi regime. When the Nazis came into power in January 1933, the Central Committee Against TB was replaced immediately by the Reich Tuberculosis Committee, which was directly controlled by the government, although supported by known TB experts. The government took over the general health-related motto, under the general health-related motto, public interest comes ahead of self-interest, or in Latin, res publica suprema lex, as demonstrated in the figure on the right. This edict changed substantially the existing concepts of TB control in many ways. For example, many TB sufferers were excluded from the society by compulsory isolation as so-called asocial bacillus spreader. During the isolation in special prison-like sanatoria, they often were systematically starved. TB sufferers in concentration camps were often abused for inhuman TB experiments. Afterwards, they were often even murdered. We have documented this terrible era in details in the book entitled Pulmonary Medicine During National Socialism, the cover of which you can see on the right. In June 1940, after the occupation of Paris, the Nazis closed the IUET office, and in November 1941, they established a new society called Association Against Tuberculosis, with the headquarters in Berlin. 15 states either belonging to the Axis Alliance or occupied themselves became members. Raffaele Paolucci from Italy was elected as president. The IUET's official journal was renamed Tuberculosis and edited by 3 German TB experts. Thus, the new association was completely in the hand of Germany and their ally, Italy. After the war, the Paris office was reopened again in 1946, and the Executive Committee of the IUET had its first meeting in that year. The first post-war conference took place in 1950 in Copenhagen, at which 43 nations participated. The Federal Republic of Germany, represented by the Central Committee Against TB, was accepted as constituent member only in 1952. The German Democratic Republic became a member even later in 1967, represented by its Society for Pulmonary Diseases and Tuberculosis. As in World War II, as in World War I, TB mortality increased steeply in many countries during World War II, as described in detail in the book Tuberculosis and War, Lessons Learned from World War II. We edited this book 2 years ago. Very sadly, my friend John Murray died from COVID-19 just on World TB Day in Paris. By the way, Phil Hopewell and G.B. Migliori both contributed 1 chapter to this book. The figure on the right shows this increase in some larger European cities. Besides Poland, which was very badly affected by TB, Germany, as many other countries, also had a sharp increase of TB cases. The pre-war TB mortality rose from 62 to between 100 and 150 per 100,000 population, in Berlin even up to 316 per 100,000 inhabitants. TB control measures were gradually re-established, somehow differing in the 4 occupation zones of Germany. In particular, the public health services with TB dispensaries were newly organized. The number of hospital and sanatorium beds was increased, and food supply was improved, especially for TB patients. BCG vaccination was introduced under the supervision of the Danish and the Swedish Red Cross, as was regular and widespread X-ray mass screening, the regular use of tuberculin testing. Because TB was caused in a large percentage of cases by Mycobacterium bovis, in particular in children, general pasteurization of milk was introduced and culling of all infected cattle was initiated. Chemotherapy was only slowly introduced, at first in the US-American zone in 1947, with streptomycin for tuberculosis meningitis in children. The cure was regarded as a miracle. In 1949, the Central Committee Against TB was relaunched only in West Germany, and before already in 1946 in the British zone. Gerhard Domag, a Nobel Prize winner in 1939, was nominated as honorary president of the committee in recognition of his research on TB drugs. The Nobel Prize had been awarded to him in 1939 for the discovery of the antibacterial effects of Frontosil, but the acceptance was prohibited by the Nazis. Thus, he received his diploma belatedly in 1947 by the Swedish King Gustav V, as shown on the photo. In 1965, the 18th International Conference of the IUET was organized in Munich, the first time in Germany. President was Erich Schröder from the German Central Committee. The post-war epidemiological situation developed differently in West and East Germany, as shown in the figure. In the first years, TB morbidity was much higher in the Soviet zone, which with more than 500 cases per 100,000 inhabitants. This caused a twofold higher TB mortality than in the West zones. However, since 1965, the situation reversed, what is explained by, firstly, more stringent TB control in the German Democratic Republic. Secondly, due to the high death rate in the early years, infectious sources were eliminated faster or to reduce the transmission. And thirdly, West Germany had much more immigrants from countries with high TB incidence. Coming back to the close relationship of the Union with the German Central Committee Against Tuberculosis, Rudolf Ferlins has to be highlighted. After his election as honorary secretary of the German Central Committee in 1985, he intensified the international relationships, in particular with the IUET. He served as president of the IUET from 1991 to 1994. In 1994, he organized successfully the World Conferences in Mainz, Germany. At this conference, he initiated the Robert-Koch Lecture. Rudolf Ferlins retired in 1995 after the centenary of the German Central Committee, which had been celebrated in Berlin with guests from the Union. In 2015, he passed away at the age of 87 in his hometown of Salzburg. One of his lasting contributions to the Union was to change the World Conferences from an event that took place every 4 years to an annual meeting. Ferlins was followed as Secretary General of the German Central Committee in 1995 by Robert Loddenkemper, who tried to strengthen the international links via the European Respiratory Society as board member since 1994 and as president in 1998 to 99. His particular aim was to promote the cooperation with Central and Eastern European countries. Since 2000, the German Central Committee organized advanced 2-month educational programs in Berlin for 40 experts from high incidence countries like China, Russia, Latvia, Belarus, and Mongolia, and hosted 2 TSRU meetings in Berlin in 1998 and 2010. He was from 2004 to 2008 president of the Europe region of the Union and organized as co-chairman the 4th Congress in Riga, Latvia in 2007, which was supported by the EIS, WHO, Euro, and the Stop TB Partnership for Europe. The 41st Union World Conference on Lung Health was held in November 2010 in Berlin, the first time at all. This conference in Berlin commemorated the 100th anniversary of the death of Robert Koch. In the main press conference, the Global TB Report 2010 of the WHO was presented by Mario Raviglione, the Parliamentary State Secretary of the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. Mrs. Gudrun Kopp assured at this occasion that Germany will continue the financial support of the Global Fund. The photo shows the participants, unfortunately without Niels Billow, the executive director of the Union, who is shown on the extra photo. Finally, the German Central Committee Against TB, as heritage member, congratulates the Union to its centenary, unfortunately only with virtual flowers. We very much hope that the common history will continue and that we can, for example, in the year 2045, celebrate together the 125th anniversary of the Union and the 150th birthday of the German Central Committee Against TB. Will TB in 25 years be eliminated? Thanks for your attention. That's the final.
Hello to everyone, and welcome to this session at which I will speak about the history of WHO and the Union, of the World Health Organization and the Union. Before I start, I just want to declare that myself, Mario Raviglione, at the University of Milan, has no conflict of interest to disclose. What I want to do is to look into the collaborations since the very first day of these two agencies, the World Health Organization and the Union, the achievements over the years, and if you allow me, in the last couple of slides, what is next? What should these two agencies do? The birth of the Union is known to everyone, is in the website of the Union. You see the link there. Union antedated the birth of WHO by several years, was born, as we all know, in 1920, in the immediate years post World War I, at a conference in Paris where 31 country delegates participated and created what was called the IUAT. During that phase, there was no World Health Organization. However, international health was already present, and there were a number of agencies that are listed there that were created during the first 20 years or 30 years of last century. Probably the crucial one is the Pan American Health Organization that lately, or later rather, became a regional office of the World Health Organization. Important, in 1945, towards the end of the war, there was a UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration that was created and had a health division. The WHO, the World Health Organization, was actually born at the immediate aftermath of World War I, and effectively in 1948. However, in San Francisco in 1945, when the United Nations were conceived for the first time, really, those three people that you see in the image there, Ivan from Norway, De Souza from Brazil, and Dr. Shea from China, were parts of their own country delegations. And as such, they came up with the idea that the new United Nations should not avoid having what was called a sort of health agency. And that was the beginning of the creation of the World Health Organization. There was an interim commission in 1946, and by 1948, the first World Health Assembly established formally in Geneva the World Health Organization. Now, the Constitution of 1946, created in 1946, and endorsed, of course, in 1948, under the leadership of Dr. Stampar, you see in the little stamp from Yugoslavia there, was a very visionary one, and essentially stated that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity, and sort of reiterated the human right to health for everyone, regardless of, as you see there, race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. Very visionary constitution. Now, what is WHO, just for those who are not familiar? UN specialized agency established, as I said, in 1948. There are nowadays 194 member states that, together with the Secretariat, constitute this World Health Organization. The headquarters are in Geneva. There are 6 regional offices in different parts of the world, of course, in different continents. And there are roughly 150 or so country offices. The staff is in the range of 7,000 to 8,000. And there have been 8 director generals that you see listed over there. The interrelation, let's say, between WHO and the Union begins very quickly. First of all, in a report that was presented in 1950, the World Health Organization Secretariat basically reports that between 1920 and 1940, the League of Nations that preceded the United Nations published some documents relevant for health, but they say there was no practical fieldwork. And only for tuberculosis, there was one international body, the IUAT, but they say it was mainly a body that was looking at academic type of activities rather than field-based activities. So that was a report by WHO in 1950. And then in the program budget for 1950, that was then done and approved by the World Health Assembly, the second World Health Assembly in 1949. That's what they say now. In 1943, there was the establishment of the UNRRA that I mentioned, and there TB seemed to be higher in the international agenda. And as you see, what they mention is that the assistance of UNRWA, although there was this more increased interest in tuberculosis, however, was really limited only to countries that had been invaded. Now, the interim committee of WHO establishes a number of committees or subcommittees. One of them was the Committee on Priorities. So this committee was put in charge, and as you see, the Secretariat included the future Director General of WHO, was put in charge of defining the priorities of the new organization. And this is actually a document that dates back to 1947. So meaning a few months before WHO was formally established. The priorities are listed there as A, B, C, and so on. And if you look at priority A, these are those that require immediate action. Not by chance, then on the right there, you find where they say we need to establish an expert committee right away. And one of the four priorities, biological standards, malaria, and the other one is international pharmacopoeia. The fourth one of the four, is actually tuberculosis. So TB becomes right away a priority for WHO. And you see here that in this report of the expert committee immediately set up. So we are in April 1947 when they recommend the establishment of a committee. In July, August 1947, so a few months later, the committee meets, establishes a few things, and acknowledges the presence of the International Union by saying that the International Union Against TB is one agency out there that has now opened a branch office in Geneva, or is opening a branch office in Geneva. And it is urged, as you see there, the committee says to WHO, it is urged that you establish immediately a relationship. So this is what happened. And now the report in 1948 of the Director General to the first World Health Assembly recognizes the fact that there are 18 non-governmental organizations that were admitted in a formal relationship with WHO. And when they list, as you see there, when they list the variety of NGOs admitted immediately in formal relationship, you will find there the International Union Against Tuberculosis. This is one of the 18 NGOs that entered into formal relationship with WHO right from the beginning of the organization. Now, I tried to find the document that described the terms of reference of this relationship between WHO and the Union, but I couldn't find anything before 1990. This document dates back to 1990. You see the name there of Annick Rouillon, who was the president of the Union at the time. And in the next page that is now depicted here, what you see is essentially the summary of these terms of reference. So what is the Union supposed to do during its next few years of official relationship with WHO? Promoting TB control and respiratory health, do studies, research, basically, collecting and disseminating the information, training, and engagement in WHO technical meetings. These are the four sort of major activities to be undertaken together. And you see then Dr. McDougall, McDougall was the secretariat of the World Health Organization in the TB section. When he reports now to the second World Health Assembly, he says, as you see on top there, that they have entered into very close contact with the two organizations. One of them is UNICEF, is not illustrated in this slide. The other one is the International Union Against Tuberculosis, where they say that the body has now been reorganized, and this would facilitate the work of WHO. And then they also say that they are going to enter into contact now with the Red Cross. Now let's go from the sort of WHO document side to the Union document side. So this is a very interesting paper by Annick Rouillon, published in 1991, where she describes what was called the Mutual Assistance Program of the Union. She says essentially there was a first phase in the 1960s and until roughly 1976. During that phase, the Union gave assistance, the headquarters of the Union, Paris, gave assistance to national anti-TB associations around the world. They were traveling there, they were preparing textbooks, they were assisting the regional offices of the Union, they were providing consultation, and so on and so forth. This phase, for example, this phase produced important documents in collaboration with WHO. This is a very important one that I invite everyone to read. We did at WHO a second edition. The first one was in 1979 by Thoman. The second edition was then in roughly in 2000, 2001. It includes all the elements of case finding and chemotherapy. And what I wanted just to show here is in the acknowledgement page, you can see there, you can read it calmly. He thanks, first of all, Dr. Mahler, who was the Director General of WHO, but then immediately after that, there is a list of names of people from the union. So those scientists, advocates for TB and so on, that were crucial in putting together this book, as an example. Then Almata comes. We are now in 1978. There is a huge movement around the world towards primary care. Almata was not uncontroversial. The United States, for example, did not participate because it was in the former Soviet Union. Ted Kennedy, you see there with the Director General of WHO on the right, Ted Kennedy participated on a personal, individual basis. Almata established the principles of what we have been calling since then primary health care. Primary health care essentially foresees the strong engagement of the communities in health, and in a way takes a position that is quite I could have put it quite different from the classical position of the national tuberculosis programs. It goes towards a horizontal way of approaching health, and particularly the primary health level, rather than through vertical programs. This actually had major consequences. The mutual assistance program of the Union now acknowledges this. And Migliori writes what you see in this particular slide. While the basic initial idea was to help National Voluntary Association Against TB, now they say, okay, since WHO has abandoned the countries, essentially, then we union should partner with their governments. And that is what she clearly acknowledges there. She says the latter, the gaining ground and that of primary care emerging, that were not necessarily favorable to TB control, the latter, she says, was coupled with a decrease in the interest and involvement of WHO specifically on TB, with suppression, and we know that from history, of regional and national advisors, shrinking of the central TB unit in Geneva, now involved in other respiratory diseases, towards what was called the integration of services. So this phase 2 of the mutual assistance program now acknowledges this situation, and she goes on and she explains that in this phase, that basically starts in the late 70s and goes on until the early 90s, then the union is engaged now in collaboration, not just with national association, but directly with governments, providing them with that kind of support that WHO essentially was not providing during that decade, in adherence with the WHO expert committee, however, in 1974, that established certain principles of TB control. Those principles became what Dr. Stiblo then implemented, starting with Tanzania and then later Malawi and Benin and so on, and that became eventually the DOTS strategy. So the mutual assistance program is illustrated by Migliori in this way. So as I said, assistance to national programs, obviously organization of world conferences, international courses, publications, and so on. But here the union takes the step of moving towards direct support to the governments in the absence, in a way, of WHO. The relationship between the union and WHO gets strengthened again when towards the late 1980s and early 1990s, WHO recognizes again the importance of tuberculosis. And you see there, I put a photo of our program. We are in the early 1990s. The program was still only about 20 or so people, became much larger 2-3 years later. But the Union and WHO re-established, in a way, collaborative activities. So the new unit that WHO had just established undertook essentially an in-depth review of the global tuberculosis situation and the possible approaches to control TB. And that was Dr. Kochi, the head of this new unit. And what Dr. Kochi did was essentially to call Dr. Stiblo, who became then a consultant of the World Health Organization. His concepts on TB epidemiology and the results that he could accumulate on the mutual assistance program were decisive for the next phase of global TB control. What happened is that they became the basis of the DOTS strategy. With Dr. Kochi, who was at the time the chief of the new unit, that in a way publishes a paper on the new strategy, new approach of the World Health Organization that is based on the mutual assistance program that Dr. Stiblo had implemented. And the collaborative achievement here is very obvious, is the DOTS strategy. The DOTS strategy gets incorporated into what is called, you see on top left there, the Framework for Effective TB Control, published by WHO in 1994, on the basis of the work of the Union particularly, and KNCB and some others, in Tanzania, in Malawi, in Benin, and other countries. In 1995, that approach is branded under the name of DOTS. And you see there the first report that says essentially DOTS stops TB, depending on how you use that cover. So essentially all the principles of the strategy that WHO started promoting in the mid-1990s, DOTS, are still valid today. They are still elements of the end TB strategy. The Union and WHO collaborated again in a number of different occasions. This is, for example, the establishment of a new partnership, what was the Stop TB Partnership at the time, very good spirit of collaboration together with all these other agencies that I list in this particular slide. It happened in Bellagio, as you see there, on 20 February 2001, when the partnership was formally established. Another example of collaboration during, now this is during the 60s, 70s, 80s, until today, is the TSRU, the Tuberculosis Surveillance Research Unit. The paper by Annick Rouillon explains the whole history of the TSRU. It came from a proposal of Dr. Meyer of KNCB. It was accepted by both the Director General of WHO, the future Director General, at the time in 1966, he was just the chief of the tuberculosis section of WHO, and the Director of the Union, Holm. They joined forces. KNCB offered the office, offered the salary, I suppose, of the first director, Dr. Stivlo, and TSRU was established as an entity to study epidemiology and surveillance of tuberculosis, especially in low incidence countries. Major contributions came over the years from TSRU. I list some of them there, but they are essentially multiple. Another major project, I'm particularly keen towards this project because I was responsible for it together, and I want to acknowledge here Dr. Adalbert Laszlo, who passed away just in the month of August this year. He was the head of the bacteriology section of the Union, and together we joined forces. I was at WHO, responsible for surveillance, and created what is now the WHO Global Project on Anti-TB Drug-Resistant Surveillance. For the first many years, it was a WHO Union project. That allows us, by the way, to understand the situation of drug resistance in the world. Another achievement, World TB Day. In reality, World TB Day was already proposed in that journal from Berlin in 1914, I believe, that basically was calling for the establishment of a day devoted to the fight against TB. It was then the Union that in 1982, 100 years after the bacillus of Koch discovery, proposed the creation of the World TB Day, celebrated World TB Day. In reality, the World Health Organization only later on, in 1997 to be precise, went to the World Health Assembly and decided to make it a formal day of celebration of the fight against tuberculosis that obviously continues year after year. A number of other achievements will be discussed probably in the same symposium here by Dr. Migliori, is the Wolfese, let me call it, movement. Wolfese workshops were organized by KNCB with the backing of the Union and the World Health Organization. They were fundamental to harmonize TB control, surveillance, activities, definitions, and so on in Europe in particular. Another activity that I wanted to mention is, and this is multiple conferences, multiple events, is country-focused science, advocacy, activism. We have seen it all during the past 20 or so years of global congresses of the Union. WHO always had a special day preceding the conference, during which we would convoke essentially the member states, the countries with the highest burden, and discuss issues related to TB. You see several images here where I am with, for example, Dr. Billo, or recently Dr. Castro and others in different occasions, including many with activists, because this was one of the purposes of these events. Finally, I want just to finish with some other collaborative achievements in the past few years. For example, the TB tobacco interaction was a joint activity between Union and WHO back in 2007. In the past decade, there was the roadmap for childhood tuberculosis and the roadmap for zoonotic tuberculosis that we produced as a joint effort. So to summarize, let me come towards the conclusion now. To summarize, as the WHO Union collaboration worked, well, there are a number of examples. Joint scientific publication, technical advice for over 70 years. IUAT control strategy that becomes, at a certain point, the basis for the DOTS strategy that, as I say, is still valid today. The principles are the same of the NTB strategy today. Joint training and country support, DTSRU achievements, the Global Drug Resistance Surveillance Network and surveys, the joint conferences and events that allowed us to disseminate science as well as advocacy for tuberculosis, the Volfese movements for Europe, the joint other advocacy efforts, and finally the roadmaps on certain aspects that are normally neglected. And to come to the conclusion, I want to just quote Jaap Broekmans, who used to direct KNCB and who is a close friend for many, many years. This is what he told me back in 1998. I asked him recently, I said, can I say it? He said, of course. He said, TB is too important a global challenge to depend only on the mood of the Director General of WHO. That was the time of the dismantling of the global TB program of the 1990s. And I fully agree with that statement. The global fight against tuberculosis needs both governmental and non-governmental forces to succeed. The former needs the latter and vice versa. WHO is obviously responsible for coordination of action and activities in the global response for all of its member states, governments. The Union is the global face of national anti-TB associations. And let me now push the agenda and say that this should be the global face of any other non-state entity. They should all be, in a way, coordinated under the umbrella of the Union. That's why the Union was created. The Union, therefore, in my view, needs to consolidate this role and become the umbrella under which all non-governmental entities, all community organizations can sit together and decide together how to coordinate their efforts and therefore synergize with the World Health Organization. I acknowledge the help in this presentation by providing some documents and some hints of Dr. Loddenkemper, Hans Rieder, Jaap Broekmans, and Dr. Urbanczyk. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this session, reviewing the Union's history of interactions with important international partners. I enjoyed the research I had to do to come up with this information, and I will admit there's not a lot in the record, so the comprehensiveness and accuracy of what I have to say may be not what it ought to be. And I will also admit to probably having a US bias in this presentation because that's what I know the best. I have no conflicts to declare. And before getting underway, I'd like to congratulate the Union on its 100th anniversary, its centennial, on behalf of the American Thoracic Society. The Union has long been, since its founding in 1920, a strong influence in global tuberculosis control policy and technical assistance, and more recently in the broader range of lung diseases. And I greatly admire the Union for its focus on solutions for the poor. So as you can see from this listing of the areas that I'll be covering in my presentation, I've broadened the chart just a bit to move from strictly organizations, both formal and informal organizations or relationships with the Union, to include influential North American individuals and perhaps a bit more controversially, some what I consider to be North American conceptual influences that have influenced not only the Union, but the world in general. So North American organizations that have been in formal relationships with the Union include the Canadian Lung Association, which was founded in 1900, and its medical section, the Canadian Thoracic Society, which was founded in 1946 as the medical section of the Canadian Lung Association. In addition, the American Lung Association, which was founded in 2004, shortly after the founding of the Union, and its medical section, the American Thoracic Society, that after the year 2000 has been completely independent of the American Lung Association and operated as an independent organization. I've included in this list the North American region of the Union, which, although a formal component of the Union, has actually operated quite independently since its foundation in 1990. And I'll discuss this in more detail later in the presentation. To look at the origins of the Union and to begin to think about how it interacts with other organizations, it's important to recognize that when the Union was formed in 1920, there were 31 countries, basically tuberculosis associations in those countries that participated. And you can see the list of countries there. And then it's mentioned in this review by Don Anderson and Annick Rouillon of the history of the Union that there were organizations from Europe and North America. So North America was involved at the outset of the Union. And North America has been the site of 5 Union meetings. I point out that the 1990 meeting in Boston was a joint meeting of the Union with the American Thoracic Society and American Lung Association. Now, until 1994, as indicated in this box, the Union meetings were held only every 4 years, but after 1994, they became annual affairs. Before 1994, the Union presidents were the directors of the host organizations in the countries where the meeting was being held. So you can see there that when the Union meeting was held in the USA, usually the director of the American Lung Association was the Union president. And likewise in Canada, when it was the Canadian Lung Association, the president was from Canada. The last 2 North American presidents that I've listed there, Anne Fanning and Jane Carter, did not come through this process because by that time the Union had changed its routine for having meetings, and both Anne and Jane I would view as products of the North American region of the IUATLD. So to look more specifically at the Canadian Lung Association and Canadian Thoracic Society involvement, I think it's highly likely that the Canadian Association did participate in the founding meeting in 1920 because, as I've indicated, this was a meeting of tuberculosis associations, national tuberculosis associations, and therefore it's likely that they participated. It was a constituent member of the Union until the organizational changes that the Union put into place several years back changed this, and constituent members no longer exist. It, as indicated in the previous slide, sponsored 2 joint meetings in Canada, and it was a participant in the Union's mutual assistance program, which connected associations in developing countries, low and middle income countries, to the associations in high income countries such as Canada. And the Canadian Lung Association for many years worked in Ecuador under this program. And it was also a co-sponsor and co-founder of the North American region of the Union. So important contributions by the Canadian Lung Association. The American Lung Association, I think, likewise, the next slide, please, likewise was a participant in the founding meeting of the Union, and likewise was a constituent member until the organizational changes were put in place. For a good while, because of the GDP of the United States and the quota of Union support that was based on that GDP, the US and the American Lung Association was the largest contributor, the largest financial supporter of the Union. And it was a sponsor of 3 joint meetings in the US, as previously noted, and was an original member with the Union in the steering committee that initially started out as developing the global plan for TB control, but through a somewhat convoluted process, this ended up being changed to the Stop TB Partnership. And I won't go into the details on that, but we'll talk more about the evolution of this steering committee group. So the North American region was founded in 19. There were 3 individuals that were championing this and ultimately succeeded in establishing the region. Lee Reichman, shown there on your left, Earl Hirschfield, American Lung Association and American Thoracic Society, and Earl from the Canadian Lung Association. And I believe at this time Earl was actually the director of the Canadian Association. And a third person, Jim Kieran from the US, who was a past president of the American Lung Association. They did this with the explicit intent of getting a seat on the board for North America that was independent of the associations. Since 1996, there have been annual meetings of the North American region, and these were initiated and championed by Anne Fanning and Patipasu Gangadaram. Anne Fanning's photo is shown there. Ganga's photo was not available, so I included the cover of one of his books in place of his photo. This was, I think, an important intervention in developing the meeting in particular, because it began to involve a much broader audience in North America than had been the case when the basic connections were through the lung associations and thoracic societies. So many infectious disease physicians and other persons in public health and TB control became involved with the union through the North American region. Initially, the North American region was supported and staffed by, on alternate years, the ALA of Chicago, and now solely by the British Columbia Lung Association. So every other year it was one of those associations. Every other year the meeting was either in Chicago or Vancouver. But more recently now it's the support is only through the British Columbia Lung Association, and the meeting is spread more widely over both of the countries. So looking now at some of the North American organizations that had informal but nevertheless influential relationships with the union, I've listed there two US government organizations, the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC. USAID has become a major funder for global tuberculosis control. I'll describe that in more detail in just a bit. And the Centers for Disease Control has been a major technical agency supporting global programs in both HIV and TB. There have been many academic institutions that have been involved with the union in one way or another, both in the US and Canada. And then there are at least three non-governmental organizations that I would list: FHI 360, Management Sciences for Health, and PATH, all of whom were involved in what I will show you was the Tuberculosis Coalition for Technical Assistance. Finally, I listed Partners in Health, and I don't know that they've had formal connection or even informal connections with the union, but I think they've been quite influential in changing the sort of attitudes about the approach to tuberculosis care and control. And again, I'll describe this a bit more in a later slide. So North American funding for global tuberculosis control, I list this because it's an area in which the union interacted with the American Lung Association, American Thoracic Society, that ended up forming a coalition that has existed until this past year. The lobbying effort for funding for global TB control was initiated by the Lung Association and Thoracic Society in 1992, this effort being led by John Murray and Fran DeMelle. Results entered into this as well in 1996, and funding was available as of FY98. With the availability of funding, USAID asked the ALA ATS to convene an advisory group. That group included the union. And this group became the sort of nucleus of what became the Tuberculosis Coalition for Technical Assistance that was founded in the year 2000 at the request of USAID. The original partners in the coalition were the union, WHO, CDC, the Dutch Tuberculosis Foundation, KNCV, and the American Lung Association, American Thoracic Society. Later, the American Lung Association pretty much ceased its international activities and dropped out, leaving the ATS as the North American representative in the coalition. So this project ended up being funded for 20 years. I'll show you some of the details in just a minute, but the coalition that became Challenge TB in its final iteration consisted of the KNCV, which was the management group for the coalition, the ATS, the Japanese Anti-Tuberculosis Association, MSH, Management Sciences for Health, the Union, with its logo there in the middle, World Health Organization, International Research and Development, PATH, and FHI 360. So an international coalition consisting of a number of organizations that were technically very experienced, and others that were very experienced in delivering programs in many different parts of the world. And in the map on your right, you see listed, probably can't read, but listed the 24 countries plus one region in which the Challenge TB Coalition had projects. So as you can see, mainly in Africa and Southeast Asia, as well as the cluster of former Soviet republics in Eastern Europe and Asia. So there were two decades of grant funding through TBCTA. What you see is that each of these iterations of the project built on the previous one, from the foundation of the structure to the completion of the structure with Challenge TB. And on the right there, you can see the annual funding of this through this coalition, or was awarded to this coalition, that increased substantially each year, or each 5-year period, and in total resulted in, or added up to, something over $900 million over the course of this 20-year period. So a very substantial amount of funding for global tuberculosis control through this coalition that included both the ATS and the Union, another very important interaction of these two organizations. Moving to the individuals, and I admittedly can't cite all the North American individuals who have had important and influential roles. I've just selected these two, both of whom have had enormous influence on the Union and on global TB control in general. On your left, Don Anderson, looking happily retired, as he is. He was Director of Scientific Activities for the Union. And on the right, his successor, Paula Fujiwara, who has had enormous influence within and without the Union. Both of these, I would submit, have been very, very important in the structure and function of the Union, as well as in global TB control in general. And you've seen Anne Fanning's picture in an earlier slide, and on the right is Jane Carter, the most recent past president of the Union. And being a Canadian, was president from 2001 to 2004, and Jane from 2012 to 2017. I've mentioned these two previously, both of whom came through the Union North American region to reach the presidency of the Union. And finally, one individual who was neither a Union staff member nor a president of the Union, and that is John Murray. As you can see listed there, John had important responsibilities within the Union, chairing several committees, including the Executive Committee and the Council of the Union in the early 1990s. But I think his important contributions actually came a bit later and were more important than chairing those committees. He actually was very instrumental in broadening the Union's focus from tuberculosis control to include other lung health issues. He also was responsible for the Union creating scientific sections focused on specific areas of interest within the organization. So again, not just TB, but a broader range of lung health areas covered. And finally, he convinced the Union to hold annual meetings rather than meetings every 4th year, which I think has greatly strengthened the image of the Union and has made it a much more effective and influential organization at many different levels, both internationally and at country level. And this is a quote from a tribute to John, who died in March of this year from COVID-19. And it makes the statement that John was extraordinarily important and one of the architects of the modern Union. So I think he deserves a place here with influential North American individuals. Finally, again, something that might be a little bit controversial, some concepts that I think at least originated to some degree in North America and were then taken up by the Union and more broadly by WHO. Preventive treatment began to be recognized as an important intervention in the United States in the late 1960s. Clearly, this was not suitable for implementation in very high incidence countries at that time, but over the course of the years, it's become recognized that prevention of tuberculosis through chemotherapeutic approaches is a very important component of enabling the globe, the world's tuberculosis programs to reach the goals that were established by the UN high-level meeting now 2 years ago. And in fact, as you've no doubt noticed, the theme of this conference is prevention. Secondly, I can't say that the US did this, but I think this is a contribution of Partners in Health, that the thinking moved from TB control with a focus on preventing transmission of the disease to a focus on TB care, which was much more an individual focus rather than a sort of programmatic focus. And this was a consequence of the partners' focus and realization that in Peru, there was a substantial amount of MDR TB. And this led to their looking in their other programs for MDR TB and certainly found a lot in Russia. And as a consequence, the focus became trying to cure these people with really severe tuberculosis, difficult to treat, expensive to treat, maybe without the without the epidemiologic impact that the TB control focus had emphasized, but nevertheless, an important way to look at dealing with this as a global problem. And finally, again, this is certainly not exclusively a North American concept, but I think the American Thoracic Society and also the European Respiratory Society have demonstrated the value of professional societies in global TB care and control by participation in coalitions such as Challenge TB that I described, and by interacting directly with the Union and with WHO to provide expertise, technical assistance, and other inputs to their programs. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning or good afternoon. I'm really happy to present the European organizations and their close relationship with the Union in this satellite symposium, History of the Union. I have no conflict of interest, just to say that I was Secretary General of the European Region of the Union from 2003 to 2007. Then I was President and Past President. And later I was Secretary General of the European Respiratory Society. And I'm presently Chair of the Global Tuberculosis Network, GTN, and Chief Editor of the Union Journal, International Journal of Tuberculosis and Lung Disease. I will focus my presentation on three main areas: the European Region Union conferences, the Volfese workshops, which have been introduced by a previous speaker, Professor Raviglione, and some educational events organized in collaboration with the Union and other organizations. The main organizations which were involved in Europe were for sure KNZV and the WHO. There was extensive presentation of the WHO collaborations by Mario Raviglione, the European Respiratory Society, and more recently, the Global Tuberculosis Network. As far as the European conferences are concerned, it was a real challenge. They started in 2002. The last was done in 2016. It's because there was basically no funding. It was necessary to look for funding, although there was strong organizational support from Paris. It was necessary to ensure collaboration with national respiratory societies, and this needs a real deep involvement by organizers. Usually conferences were organizing TB and non-TB tracks, and the main challenge was the need to identify sponsored speakers with the risk of having always the usual suspects as speakers, and then to ensure translation into Russian. And then it's clear that these conferences were essential steps to increase collaboration and understanding between Eastern and Western Europe over the last 20 years. The first conference for which I found slides and images was Bucharest. I didn't have any on Budapest. This was organized in 2002 with more than 1,000 participants, with a strong participation and link with the Romanian Society of Respirology and the national program. The topic was Constraints and Opportunities for Tuberculosis and Lyme diseases in Europe. And these were the years in which the DOT strategy was launched. We see here different personalities, which include, for example, Dr. Zellweger. He is the chair of the conference, giving a prize to Dr. Roshinho. The icon is there. And in Moscow in June 2004, there was the chance to organize a real large fun Russian speaking conference, probably the largest ever organized by the Union, for sure the largest organized in Europe, with more than 5,500 participants. The conference hosted a course for journalists, initiative of Lee Reichman, and this was extremely important for advocacy in Russian-speaking countries. We see here Professor Ciuccialin, Professor Perelman, Dr. Raviglione presenting, this is myself, and this was the reception in Kremlin Palace during the opening. This was the course for journalists, Mike Eisman, and we see Hans Rieder, Richard Zalewskis. The WHO stand, this was the press conference, Professor Perelman. This was the very beautiful opening ceremony. In Riga, it was possible in July 2006 to organize an excellent conference, like an ideal bridge with Eastern Europe. And this was organized by Dr. Lehmann, who unfortunately left us. We see here a moment of the opening ceremony with Professor Loddenkemper, was the president at the time, and Vaira Lemane we see here, and very young Denis Falson. In Dubrovnik in June 2009, it was time of my presidency. We have a picture here showing the visit we paid with Dr. Zellweger and the president of the local society at the conference center during its construction. And the small joke when they gave me the cap of captain as president of the conference, etc., was a small size conference, but really good quality. And this hosted a postgraduate course and some educational activities which were supported by the European Respiratory Society. In 2012, the conference was organized in London under the presidency of Jean-Pierre Zellweger. As Secretary General was Maurice Warning from Belgium at Imperial College, Tuberculosis, lung disease, threats and promises. And in 2016, Ivan Solovic organized a great event in Slovakia, in Bratislava, and the theme was No Share Act in TB and non-TB diseases, in respiratory diseases. The events hosted also high-level hosts, including the president of Slovakia during the presidency that Slovakia had of the European Union. Then I want now to open a bit on the history of the Wolfese workshops that were organized under an idea of Professor Rotala at the time of the Wolfese I, the first president of the European region of the Union, and the strong support of Dr. Jaap Boekmans and Jaap Veen, we see here in the picture. Jaap Boekmans was the director of KNCB, and Jaap Veen was the senior consultant for Europe. We see here in the picture. And this was my entry in the TB family after my PhD in Africa. And this was initially planned as a meeting of 40 experts for all TB incidence countries, mainly focused on TB elimination, while training promising young physicians. I was one of the 2 young physicians, and the other one was Akiro Seita, that was very important in Northern Africa as TB reference person for WHO. Initially, the meeting included US, Canada, and Japan, and was done in Wolfese, the original place, which was very famous as Austria, a famous battle in the Second World War. Now the concept evolved, and KCV is organizing this with WHO Euro and the CDC, and is hosting WHO and the CDC meetings, and is organized now in The Hague, and no more in the original Wolfese place. We see here, this was myself at the time, much younger, and this is Mario Raviglione. We saw here some pictures of that very first event. Professor Grosset, we see Donald Anderson, who was the Director of Scientific Activities of the Union, and Hans Rieder, long and black hair. And this was the document which is summarizing the Wolfese initiative, which was already presented by Professor Raviglione. And this document presents the different Wolfese meetings with the topics and the main results. We will see them one by one. And some pictures, this was the original place in the Wolfese forest. And we have here a friend who left us, Andrea Infuso, who was very important in developing the evaluation of treatment outcomes, as we will see soon. So in the document, we see the different Wolfese workshops with their topics. Basically, in Wolfese 1 and Wolfese 5, there was focus on rationale and background of the TB elimination strategy, and this produced two papers, one coordinated by Luke Clancy, here on the left, and the second at the Wolfese 5, coordinated by Jaap Boekmans, myself, with the European Framework for TB Control and Elimination in Low TB Incidence Countries, which was one of the background documents which brought later in 2014 to the development of the WHO Framework for TB Elimination in Low TB Incidence Countries. And as our researchers have included here the number of citations of these papers which were published in the AJ, which was really important, almost 300 times cited. In the Wolfese 3, the focus was on surveillance, and Rieder coordinated the effort, as we see here. This document was very important with the definition of definite case, the bacteriologically culture confirmed ones, and the 7 core variables to collect. This was the milestone document for TB surveillance in Europe, and this made possible to have surveillance at the CDC organized since 2007 via a specific project funded by the EU, it was called UTB, at the Institut de Veille Sanitaire in Paris. This was originally managed by Andrea Infuso and then by Dennis Falson, a very important initiative. This is the Wolfese 3, which was done no more in Wolfese, but near The Hague, in Norway. And the next step, still in Wolfese 3, was the definition of the 6 mutually exclusive treatment outcome definitions, standardizing treatment outcome monitoring in Europe. This was milestone document as well for surveillance of the treatment outcomes for tuberculosis in Europe. And after 2007, the CDC started recording and publishing them on a yearly basis. Also, this document was cited more than 170 times. In the first Wolfese meeting, the next logic step was the standardization of anti-TB drug resistance surveillance in Europe as part of this Union WHO document and process, which was presented by Mario Raviglione in one of the preceding presentations. And this was the milestone document for surveillance of drug resistance in Europe, that was then collected on a regular basis. And we see below here how the original table with the way of presenting the data was conceived. We move now to other initiatives like the Union courses, which have been organized by the Union in Paris together with the ERS and through the European Respiratory Society TB Collaborating Center it was directing at the time. There were two courses, on the basic one on TB management and the one on MDR TB management, and those were conducted in Spanish, and we see here some pictures with Pepe Caminero as course director and Alberto Mendoza as the deputy director. The Union has an office in Lima, and this course is still extremely important in training human resources in Latin America in Spanish. Recently, there were other consensus documents developed with the participation of experts from the Union and other organizations, like this document coordinated by the Global Tuberculosis Network, which involved more than 100 experts from all over the world, let's say, making the point on MDR-TB management. As concluding remarks of this short but intensive story, the European Region conferences were essential steps to bridge East and West, establish robust collaborations, and open the way to a European approach to prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of tuberculosis, with focus also on other respiratory diseases. The Evolvese initiative was the historical engine of the basic principles and documents, allowing Europe to equip itself with surveillance policies and guidelines for TB control and elimination. And other relevant initiatives had the Union, either the Union or the European region of it, actively collaborating with KNCV, ERS, WHO, and other organizations. I really thank you very much for hearing, just reminding that it is possible to navigate safely also with the availability of limited resources. Thank you and a great day.